Hi, what I'd like to do in this screencast is to give you a review for Exam 2. And Exam 2 is going to cover chapters 3, 9, and 12. So I just wanted to give you some tips on how to prepare for this exam and hopefully give you some ideas where mistakes have been made in the past so that you can avoid them. The first thing that you need to bear in mind, and I want you to remember this is very, very, very important. I do have an automatic grader for this exam, and the reason I have the automatic grader is that it makes it easier for me to grade it quicker and therefore to get the grades back to you. However, it's not perfect. If there's a difference in spelling, a difference in spacing, a difference in capitalization, there are all sorts of reasons why the automatic grader will not count some of your answers, and I also have some that I don't have an automatic answer for. So the first grade that you get back will be low. I still have to go through each exam by hand and give you credit. There are also answers that could get partial credit that won't get partial credit with the automatic grader. So when you get your first grade back, don't freak out, don't get upset. Wait until I've gone through it by hand, and you'll be able to tell because it'll have gone up fairly quickly. Or I'm sorry, fairly significantly. So again, when you do your exam, the automatic grader will give it a grade, but that will not be your grade until I go through all of them. And obviously, if you have a question as to whether the grade that you see is your actual grade, just let me know, okay? And I'll certainly let you know as soon as I can. Now, the exam itself will consist of 3 parts. The first part will be, and I don't know if they come in this exact order, but the first part will be 6 questions worth 3 points each, like the problems that we did in chapter 12. So where you're given a scenario and you're asked to critique that scenario. Now again, there won't be any where there's just no problems. So make sure you go through and look at the problems from chapter 12 and look at how you answered those. The other thing is there will be 20 questions worth 3 points each that are exactly like the problems in 3.4 part 3, where you have to identify the fallacy. You don't have to justify why it's a fallacy, but identify the fallacy that's committed, or if it's not a fallacy, just write no fallacy. All right, those are worth 3 points each. And again, partial credit for getting close. So don't leave any of these blank. Also, I'll tell you that there will not be any suppressing the evidence. There will not be any suppressing the evidence on this exam, just because suppressing the evidence, you really have to know information outside of what's given you, and that makes it a bit tricky. So don't worry about suppressed evidence. You have to know the 3 different ad hominems: abusive, tu quoque, and circumstantial. And you also, with ad populums, you can know appeal to the people direct or appeal to the people indirect. You don't have to distinguish between vanity, snobbery, and bandwagon for appeal to the people indirect. False cause, you only have to know false cause. You don't have to know the different types of false cause. And finally, I'm going to go over some of this later, by the way. Finally, there are 11 questions worth 2 points each that will be like the first couple of questions in chapter 9. So you'll get a scenario, and then each added piece of information. Does it strengthen, weaken, or have no effect on the argument? All right. For chapter 12, the first thing to bear in mind is remember that a sample is random if and only if every member of the population has an equal chance of being selected. So look at sampling and how samples are determined as one way of critiquing an argument. And remember that self-selection is not random. Anything that depends on a person voluntarily answering rather than being asked questions is not going to be random. Don't forget psychological factors. Don't forget that there are certain questions that will not elicit an honest response. There are certain questioners who may not elicit an honest response. And that the way a question is phrased could have a bearing on how it's answered. Also, be aware of the margin of error. And there's a table in the book, and there's also a slide in the PowerPoint slides. And be aware of how the margin of error works and be able to consult that chart. So keep that chart handy with you, either by having your book or the PowerPoint slide next to you that talks about the different margins of error for different sample sizes. And finally, be aware of how percentages are obtained. All right, so obviously if we're going to look at an argument based on percentages, realize that percentages are based on a relationship between two factors, and know what factors are being related and be able to do that. Okay, that's the first set. And of course, be aware of the importance of having scales. I should have put this on here. Be aware of the importance of having scales when you look at charts. So knowing where the scale starts and also how much interval is covered on each axis. All right, chapter 3. Sorry, let me pull us back up. Sorry about the sound effect. Oh, what did I do? That's not what I wanted to do. I somehow managed to edit the slide. That wasn't my intention. So let's pull the slide back down. And let's pull the window back up. There we go. Okay. Sorry. This is what my students, by the way, in my in-class class have to deal with all the time is my technological ineptness. You're just getting a small sample of this. So here we are in chapter 3. And here are certain fallacies you should be aware of in terms of differences. Straw man and red herring. Straw man, remember, you take an argument that someone made and you distort it. So as part of the argument, it should be so-and-so said, or some group claims, and then it distorts that claim and attacks the claim. Red herring just changes the subject. Okay, so straw man kind of changes the subject, but the way it does it is by distorting someone's claim, whereas red herring just moves on to a tangentially related subject that really has nothing to do with the argument. All right, accident and weak analogy. Accident, again, you have a rule. Okay, it refers either explicitly or implicitly to a rule, and it applies the rule to an area where the rule doesn't necessarily apply. And weak analogy is a little bit different. A weak analogy compares two different things. Okay, it's not comparing a rule and an occurrence of a thing. It's comparing two things that are supposedly similar, and says that because those two things are similar, in some ways they have a similarity in another way. And of course, a weak analogy is when that's not a good argument. And again, I would refer to the material in chapter 9 when you're determining whether an argument is weak or not. Argument from authority. Remember that an authority has to be someone who has expertise. It has to be someone who's unbiased. And it has to be someone who's reliable to count as an authority figure. So appeal to unqualified authority is a fallacy when the person cited as an authority doesn't have all of those things. And remember that you can attack an authority if somebody makes their authority part of the argument. So you can attack someone for being biased if they're saying that this person's an authority figure, but if somebody's making an argument, you just look at the premises and conclusions. So if somebody's authority is not part of the argument, that's when it becomes ad hominem. All right, and again, I would urge you to go back and look at the slides, the PowerPoint slide on ad hominem to clarify that point. Finally, ad ignorantium. People love to say that something is appeal to ignorance because a lot of our fallacies involve ignorance. But ad ignorantium is a particular kind of ignorance. What it says is nobody has proved the other side, therefore my side is correct. All right. So look for nobody has ever proved, and that's likely to be either an ad ignorantium or, if it's a good argument, no fallacy. Circular arguments are only a fallacy if the circularity is somehow done deceivingly. So if I say this wall is blue, therefore this wall is blue, that's not going to be begging the question because the circularity is not being hidden. But if I say this wall is blue because it has an azure-like tint, that's circular because azure-like tint is basically blue in other language. And those of you that have better color distinctions than I am, I'm hoping won't call me on the fact that maybe azure and blue aren't exactly the same. But in any case, because I'm just saying the same thing in different words, that would be begging the question. Amphibole. Amphibole is difficult to see sometimes because at times when we look at amphibole arguments, we buy into the misinterpretation. Remember, amphibole involves ambiguous wording. But what I usually say is if you look at a problem and it kind of makes you laugh, look for amphibole. If you look at something and you're not sure if there's any fallacy committed, see if one of the sentences is ambiguous. All right. So That's my what I have to say on those. Now, I also want to mention one more thing. Here's one that people have trouble with. Composition goes from each to everything together. So if I have a jar of marbles, no, I'm not going to say a jar of marbles. Let's say a bunch of bricks in my front yard, and I say I can lift each of the bricks in this pile, therefore I can lift the entire pile. That's composition. Okay? Division. If I say the entire pile of bricks is 4 feet tall, therefore each individual brick is 4 feet tall, right? I'm going for everything together to each. That's division. Hasty generalization. Let's say there are a bunch of bricks and I pull one brick out of the pile and I say this brick is green, therefore all the bricks are green, just based on one brick. That might be hasty generalization. Okay, there I'm going from one sample to saying that each brick has these qualities. All right, so know the difference between composition, division, and hasty generalization. And remember, these are only fallacies if it's illegitimate. So if you go back to the slide, you'll see there are cases where what's true of each is true of everything together. What's true of everything together is true of each. And so make sure that these are illegitimate uses of these types of arguments. For Chapter 9, remember that Chapter 9 gives you a scenario and then gives you individual pieces of information. Take into account each previous piece of information when determining if the next piece of information strengthens, weakens, or has no effect. So if one piece of information says, and I don't know, comparing bicycles, and June's is blue and Judy's is red, and then the next thing you have is that June is a Pisces or something like that. And I know this is all irrelevant now that I think about it, but you want to say that obviously this is the same June who had the blue bicycle. So again, take all the pieces of information and add the next piece as if all the other ones before were true. Also remember, strengthening a counter-analogy weakens the argument. So if you have a counter-analogy and then you get information that strengthens that counter-analogy, the entire argument is going to be weaker. And also, this is slightly counterintuitive, but the more specific a conclusion is, the weaker the argument's going to be. Okay, the more specific the conclusion, the weaker the argument. So the more broad the conclusion, the stronger the argument. It's just harder to prove a more specific point. If you have any questions, post them in the discussion. Okay. Obviously, if you need the question answered more quickly than within 24 hours, go ahead and shoot me an email. But it's best to do it in the discussion so other people can benefit from your answers. All right. I hope you feel like this has prepared you well for the exam. Again, post any questions you have, and good luck.